Hi everyone. This video will train you on our upcoming list of species for Resilient Trees 3.0, which will be running from January until June of 2017. This tutorial will also cover a little bit on how to identify tree species in general before we get into the actual species that we'll be studying. So before we get started, some basics on how to identify a tree based on its species. So we provide you with some resources to do that. The first major resource that you'll need is the tree key or tree ID key, which is in all the toolkits that we provide as well as online via the Dropbox. So definitely hang on to that resource and have it with you when you go out into the field. Some other resources you might not be as familiar with. So obviously when you go out in a group with volunteers, a lot of them might actually know the species or particular species just for whatever reason. Maybe they garden in their spare time, maybe they planted that tree recently. So don't hesitate to ask your group if you're ever on the hunt for these trees and need some help. And also as another resource for if you're looking at a tree and you're kind of 95% sure it's a species that we're looking for, but you really need some help making that definitive call. If you're using iNaturalist, which is very convenient because you can take pictures, you can click the ID help button. And the pictures in any case are being uploaded to your own account, and there's actually a whole community of people who can actually confirm that identification for you, and we'll take a look at it ourselves as well. If you're not using iNaturalist and you're using more of the, the toolkits with the GPS device, basically you can follow the picture protocol. Take a camera, take some photos, and when you submit it along with your data, just add a comment to the sheet or the spreadsheet that you're typing it into to basically let us know, like, okay, we have the pictures for this, but we want you to confirm for sure whether that's the actual tree species that we want, just to let us know to take a closer look at those photos. Some other tools that will be useful for you in terms of identifying trees. There are obviously lots and lots of dedicated books. So if you have, a naturalist guide or something like that, that can be very useful in terms of doing some further research into these tree species. There's also a lot of online resources. So if you really wanted to get in depth into certain of the tree species that we're going to list here, there's lots of options. Select Tree, Urban Tree Key ID, quick Google search. There are a lot of things online you can take a look at as well. And like I mentioned before, iNaturalist is also a very useful tool. So if you follow the training protocols on that and are able to use your smartphone, you might have some more resources in the field to be able to identify species as well. And another really useful thing to do is also if you know that you're going to be trying to track down certain tree species, it's very helpful to visit a live example. So if if you can go to arboretums, you can go to nurseries. If you look on Tree Map LA, which is an inventory tool, you can kind of find a tree of that or an example of that tree near you and take a look at it in person because there's really no replacement for seeing something in 3D. And a final note about identifying tree species is that it's really important to have an eye for detail. Identifying trees is a lot like facial recognition. So if you're able, by saying that someone has brown eyes, that's not going to be the definitive way of telling it's that person or not. You're looking at a lot of different things, like how does their face shape? What does their nose look like? What kind of color hair do they have? So it's kind of that process of putting all those different identifying features together to actually make a confirmed ID. So hopefully when you are going through these actual tree species that you'll keep that in mind. So also another thing to look for is a major way that you identify trees is by the leaf. So leaf shape and where it connects is really important in terms of paying attention and really getting a close look at those leaves. So there's two major categories of leaf types. So the first is that if the leaf kind of divides into these little leaflets where it's kind of spread out, it kind of separates from the stem, that's considered a compound leaf. So that's what that terminology means. The other type of leaf that you can get is a whole or simple leaf. So the leaf is all together. So it's a single leaf that that basically has a single shape to it, and it kind of connects to the stem directly instead of branching off. Another thing to look at, other than the actual shape, is the edges. So many leaves will have special edges in terms of, are they serrated? Do they have these little cut marks all along them? Or are they smooth along the edges? So that sometimes is a good indicator for a species species. Also looking at the attachment, you also want to look within the leaf itself, but also like how does it connect to the branch? Does it tend to cluster? Does it kind of spread out along the branch? Those are also things to keep in mind. And sometimes the color as well. So there's different shades of green, and some will range all the way from this really bright green all the way down to dark blue or something like that. So it can really range in terms of where on the spectrum that'll fall. Another thing to look at is also whether it's deciduous or evergreen. So deciduous just means, it loses its leaves periodically at some point in the season, or evergreen where those leaves will stay on the tree basically all year round. So those are the kind of categories that you can look for when it comes to leaves. Some other things to look at is bark. So texture. So texture, it could be furrowed, it could be scaly, it could be smooth. Some of the trees have very unique colors in terms of their bark, especially within the overall family, that maybe that particular species has a particular color associated with it. However, we do note this in your tree key ID, but it's also another thing to look out for, is that sometimes trees within the same species will have variants. So for example, a person might have smooth hair, and then their sister or something will have curly hair. So that doesn't mean that they're different species or they're not related, but it's just something to keep in mind. So we'll say that in the tree key ID, whether it's the only bark of its type or whether it's just a general recommendation on what it looks like. Another thing to look at is the shape of the canopies and the height and density of that canopy, and kind of the overall, like, how is this tree growing? Because sometimes that's also a very good indicator in terms of, is it very narrow canopy? Does it spread out a lot? And that'll help you with some of the harder species identifications. Also reproductive parts, so nuts, fruits, flowers, pods, etc. It's often unique to that tree. Or there's something special about those flowers or something like that that'll help distinguish it from other look-alike species. And obviously it depends on the season. It's a little bit difficult in Southern California just because we have trees kind of growing all over in terms of seasons, because it's not really their natural habitat. So, just keep in mind that you might be on the lookout for all of these things, regardless of what the technical season is. So keep that in mind. And another final note in terms of identifying our set of species specifically is that the species are kind of picked along a global distribution. So they often give hints. So if a tree is from a certain region originally, it might have some more distinguishing features to it. So for example, if it's kind of from the Mediterranean region, it tends to have silver gray or very small leaves, and generally tends to be evergreen instead of deciduous. For North America, it's kind of the traditional tree that we think of, where it's generally very simple leaves, where it's a whole leaf, it stays together. It tends to be deciduous, those nice fall colors that we get. And also, it's not really known for its flowers. It's more known for its leaves and its bark and things like that. In South America, you kind of have the opposite effect, because we're dealing with very rainy climate. So tropical species like that tend to have very, very showy flowers. So it's very exotic looking. Also, it tends to have very glossy leaves because it's used to shedding water. So that's also something that you can keep in mind for that. We also have a lot of Australian species this time around. So if you think of a traditional Australian, eucalyptus or something like that, often it's very pungent, so it has a very unique, strong smell. Tends to be very hardy, and also tends to have peeling bark that, to basically as a protection against insects and things like that. Also, we have a lot of Asian species, so those tend to have smaller leaves and also very fragrant flowers and pods and kind of like unique fruit. So it's kind of like a very exotic looking fruit generally on the tree. But specifically we'll go into all of these species, but try to keep that in the back of your mind in terms of classifications. So first up, we have our first and only European species. So this is the Canary pine. So it's from the Canary Islands. And when you say pine, it's very easy to kind of lump them all into the same category, but there are lots of different varieties of pines and different species. So for this particular species, obviously it's a pine, so it's got needles. It's got, pine cones and things like that, but it's different than other pines in that The shape is very, very upright. It's very narrow, and it kind of goes straight up and kind of stays close to the trunk. A lot of other pine species will tend to spread out or be very, extend really far and get really droopy. This is a very upright tree, so that's something to keep an eye out for. Also, the bark is a little bit thicker. It's much more furrowed. It's kind of this reddish bark. So, unlike some other pines that have very smooth bark, this is going to be very furrowed and very thick. So pay special attention to those two features, as well as kind of like this very fluffy kind of pom-pom looking shape of its needles, the way it tends to cluster. And then that'll help you with your identification. So next up for coming into the North American species, so the liquid amber Styraciflua, the American sweetgum, essentially. It tends to look a lot alike to the London plane tree or sycamores and things like that, mostly because those trees tend to have these very spiky pods at the end, and those pods tend to look a lot like other species with similar deciduous kind of structures. However, the way that you can tell the sweet gum apart from those other species is by really paying close attention to the leaf shape, but also in terms of the size and the way that it clusters around. So unlike a sycamore, these leaves tend to be very star-like and very close and compact. So it doesn't tend to really spread out in terms of being a huge leaf. And you can kind of see how it tends to cluster around the branch as well. So in terms of looking at the pods, that's definitely a good indicator, but don't let that be the only way that you identify the species. And also looking at the other features as well. So it's got this kind of very furrowed bark, very scaly actually, as well as kind of like this tall canopy that tends to go around the trunk. But definitely take a close look at those leaves when identifying this. So the other North American species that we have on our list is the honey locust, or Gleditsia triacanthus. So the way that you distinguish this tree is that it has a like this very greenish bark, and it tends to be on the smoother side. And when it grows, it tends to form these kind of long flower clusters that eventually turn into these pods. And these pods get very dark red as it matures and gets older. So it's this general shape, but just basically really dark red. And another feature of this is that it can have this kind of interesting way of forming thorns along the trunk. So this isn't every single cultivar. So if you don't see it, it's not that it's not the same species. But if you do see it, then you know for sure that is the species, because it has these very thorny extensions emerging directly out of the trunk, which is very unusual for a tree. Otherwise, if you don't see this, another thing to pay close attention to is these very fern-like leaves, essentially, and then tends to form a very lacy fern-like crown all the way around the top. So it's very feathery, it's very fluffy, essentially. So pay attention to the leaves, the pods, and this kind of all together as a single portrait in order to make this identification. So moving on to the South American species that we have on our list, it's a very common tree. It's the Brazilian pepper tree. In California, there's basically two types of pepper trees that are really common. There's this particular pepper tree species from Brazil. However, there's also Peruvian pepper that almost has identical fruit. So basically, the only difference is basically looking at the leaves on that particular tree. So when you come to a tree like this, the first thing that should tip you off is the fruit, but take a very close look at the leaves to make sure that that's actually the same species that we're looking for. Because this is helpful, but there are also other trees that have kind of this red colored pink peppercorn fruit, essentially. So when you're looking at the leaves, they're very oval and very long and kind of large, essentially, versus a Peruvian pepper, which has to have very tiny leaves all along, very tiny compound leaves along the stem. So just keep an eye out for the leaves when you're looking at that. Other than that, I mean, we have some scaly furrowed bark as well. It's very gnarled, as well as this kind of fluffy tree canopy that we're dealing with lots of leaves around it. So for the Australian species that we have, so we do have a eucalyptus species on our list. However, there are about 300 varieties of eucalyptus in California, so it's obviously very important to make sure that you just don't grab the first eucalyptus that you see and think that it's necessarily the red ironbark species that we're looking for. So in terms of, most of you are familiar with what a eucalyptus looks like, very pungent. It's got a kind of these long spear-like leaves. This particular species species has kind of bluish leaves, like on the blue-green side of the spectrum, and these obviously red stems. But the way that you distinguish it from other eucalyptus species is definitely taking a look at the bark. So unlike other eucalyptus species, this species actually keeps its bark all year round, so it just keeps building thick layers on top of it, so it doesn't actually peel like the rest of the species do. And it's obviously this very dark red color, which is very distinguishable from other eucalyptus. Another way of distinguishing it from other species is that if you take a close look at the pods that come out of the eucalyptus, they actually have very subtle variations between them. So this particular species, it's basically like the round pod has been cut off in the first quarter of it. So it's very round, but then like the first quarter has been cut off. So if you look at other pods, a lot of them will have stars on them, like a lot of them will be cut off further down. So keep an eye out for that if you really need some help distinguishing this particular species. So for the next Australian species we have is the broadleaf paperbark. So this species is distinguished by one of the big distinguishing features rather is this very like peely bark. It basically like just keeps shedding from the trunk and is very distinctive when you look at it. However, there are also a lot of Melaleuca species in California. So in order to distinguish this from other trees that have this feature, take a really close look at the leaves. So this particular species, out of the other Melaleuca species, has the largest leaves. So it's very long. It's about 1.5 inches versus an inch in terms of sizing. And also a lot of the other species will have very tiny leaves, so they'll like look more like a rosemary or something like that, where it's very spiky. However, this species has these kind of longer leaves that also alternate along the stem, so they'll just keep going around, kind of like this rotor effect. So that's something you also want to look out for, in addition to these kind of unique looking pods, as well as the flower color is more of a white, and then it kind of shoots out directly from the stem as well. So try to keep all of those things in mind when trying to make the when you see the bark basically, and then decide which species it is from there. Also, the final Australian species we have is the Kurrajong or bottle tree. So one of the interesting features of this tree is that it has a very bulgy trunk. So it's kind of a drought resistant feature, but basically it's very long, extends pretty far, and then it'll kind of have this round like bulge to the side of it. Very smooth bark on the most part. And one thing to keep in mind, or one thing to keep an eye out for, is that it has these very like almost heart-shaped leaves. They tend to taper a lot. They cluster. It kind of has this very kind of like loose, waxy looking complexion to it. So it'll kind of form these huge pom-poms around this very like tall and upright canopy. And another thing to keep an eye out for, obviously this depends on what season the tree it thinks it is. So if you see flowers on it, that's also a really good indicator. It has these very white bell-like flowers with kind of pink, spattering on the inside. So if you see the leaves and with that flower combination, that's a good indicator. And eventually the flowers will turn into this very dark, hard pod with a bunch of little seeds inside of it. So that's also a good indicator when trying to identify this species. So moving on to the Asian species that we have on our list, we also have the Chinese banyan, also known as the Indian laurel fig, if you're looking at different inventories. And this is a really, really common straight tree, so you actually will probably see this around quite a bit. And it's distinguished by, it has this very like white or gray white smooth bark associated with it, and it has a lot of these very waxy dark green leaves. So if you pay close attention to the shape of the leaves, as well as the kind of waxiness on the front of it, if it's in the kind of the blooming season, it'll have these kind of like white clusters of pods as well. But basically, it's a really common street tree, so it's probably easy. It's something that you're probably familiar with. So keep that in mind. So the another Asian species that we have on our list is the Chinese elm. So elm trees are fairly common. So it's very easy to take a look at a tree and notice that it's an elm. Like it's got these very kind of like waxy, kind of like wrinkly leaves associated with it. It's very like oblong shaped. But one way that you can distinguish it is obviously it has these little tiny tiny pods along the inside of the leaf. So if it's fruiting, then that's a good indicator as well. But if you're looking at an elm tree and wondering whether it's the Chinese elm, the way you can distinguish it is by the bark. So the bark is very scaly and it tends to flake off. And when it flakes off, it's like kind of gray on the outside and then almond colored on the inside. So it's this very mottled type of bark and a unique color as well. So that's one way you can tell it apart from its other elm species that it might be near. And the final Asian species that we have is the camphor tree. So the way that you can distinguish it is that the trunks and the root basically the roots are very, very aggressive. So as it gets older, it'll tend to widen, and it'll start kind of eating the sidewalk or the asphalt or whatever it tends to be near. So it starts getting really wide at the bottom. So if you can look at the kind of big root structures, and that's a good tip off that you're looking at the right trunk. And the way that you identify it is that the leaves have a unique smell, so it actually smells like camphor, which is where it gets its name. And then so it's kind of this kind of wrinkled, like fluttery looking leaf essentially that clusters quite densely. And also on top of the leaves, it has during its season, it has a very delicate white flower kind of poking out of it, which eventually turns into these fruits. And as it ripens, it starts getting black, and then it'll kind of shoot out through the leaves as well. So that's kind of between the smell and the fruits and the wide trunk, you can kind of identify the species. So that's all of our species. I'd recommend you take a look at the tree key ID at this point. Try to get to know these species really well, as well as take the quiz that we have available online. Thanks for listening.